Now, the official topic is Science and Technology Governance, the Role of International Forums and Financial Institutions. You'll see in the program that there are 4 general topics that are listed for discussion. Governance in the context of globalization, intermediaries or boundary organizations and funding mechanisms, the dynamics of science funding in Russia, and market values and the scientific enterprise, examples of commercialization of science in Russia. Now, to start the discussion going, we're going to have some brief presentations of no more than 10 minutes. And the order of the speakers will be starting first with Dmytri Galkin, followed by Nikolai Tarabanov, and then Elena Sимакова and Evgenia Popova will make a presentation together. And for their presentation, so after the first 2 speakers, I will be passing out the questionnaire on the basis of which their research is founded, so you can see what exactly they have been working on. And so without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Dmytri.
Thank you, Steve. This is an honor to be opening act for such a concert. And I'd like to start with a little story told by one of our respondents during the interview. And this is a story about he's a pretty well-established professor. Like in academic world, if you follow Mikhail's presentation earlier today, he is on the top of the academic certification. And story about him applying for a grant provided by a Russian foundation, fundamental researcher. So what they did, they took one of the sort of top academic journals in the field from the West, found a really good article they liked, and the topic was kind of well close to what they do, but not really exactly what they do. And after that, they reinvented the whole thing for the grant application. And you know what? Did they get the thing? They did. So they got the not really big funding, but enough in terms of collecting money from different sources. So for me, this is the illustration of the game this kind of people have to play now in the academic world. And just a little bit of the context, because this research material, still more material than sort of proper product, is based on interviews and well, my part is mostly based on interviews and supported by one of the funding, governmental funding bodies here in Russia. So, what I use interviews for the purpose to illustrate what's happening with money and market and trends in governance in Russian science. So both experts and applicants for grants, they refer to sort of strange and mythological international level of research. So the major sort of purpose and orientation is the international level. only one expert mentioned that there is a sort of tension between national scientific tradition here in Russia and bigger international scale. This is sort of current common sense. If you want to do proper research, follow the international level. Experts say, first thing I pay attention to is the international context. Applicants say, what we do first, we review sort of cutting-edge international publications. And this is the biggest frame for, I think, decision-making and resource allocation in academic world. And clearly, it makes sort of certificational divide, because if you do something very interesting in national, say, social science tradition, history of Russian social theory in Russia, you are sort of already marginalized. So if you are, so you don't even need to apply. You shouldn't apply, right? So the value of your research immediately becomes not just local, but kind of wrong, right? So you don't do anything interesting. Otherwise, you justify that this local stuff you do is really correspondent to some freshest publication in biggest journal in UK, and this is why you can apply for financial support. And I think again, following Mikhail's idea about stable academic certification, I think this is a sort of another way to look at that, because this sort of content-oriented certification, the good scholar is a global scholar, and bad scholar, even you are a professor, and you are on the top, but if you do some local stuff, it doesn't count. And what is interesting in terms of funding, I thought this problem was somehow solved, but it is not. Specifically, again, both experts and applicants, they agree that there is another line of certification between, it's geographical. So basically, from 2/3 to 3/4 of money go to, you know where. In academia, I mean Russian Academy of Science and university world, most of the cash goes to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So to the, it's centralized, and geographical periphery becomes also periphery in terms of funding. And there is a nice story from the expert who actually is involved in decision making about grant allocation. He says, see how it happens. People in Moscow lobby to get the grant from some, say, really friendly institution, but they get the money, then they call me saying, you know what, we got the money, and offer him 15–20% share to do the full job, and everything else stays in Moscow. So, and this is really political aspect of the governance, because and it keeps supporting this geographical sort of common sense decision making. You guys, say from Tomsk or from Vladivostok, you guys should understand that, I mean, the major science happening not in your region, right? And according to some observations, the share of regional funds for regional institutions is declining, and the share for central institutions growing. Maybe Mikhail has some more statistical evidence to that because I did research on university ratings. But so, thank you, Steve. I just wanted to make some introductory observations on what we found out from our research, and if you have any questions.
We can hold the questions till we have
Okay.
And we'll move now to Nikolai. Yes, you.
I put on your microphone. Okay. Thank you. I'm Nicolai Tarabanov. I have a little presentation, 4 or 5 minutes for you. I have, okay. So, I would like to talk about the role of ethics in science and technology governance, and about what can we say about it. And so, of course, technology gives us an opportunity to want more and more, and science provides needful knowledge, socially constructed, about possible consequences of wishes realization of wishes. And any knowledge is always restricted, so if we are going to use it, this or that knowledge, for solving practical problems, we should be careful of consequences, and including ethical, apparently. And so precautionary principle is needed. And the question is raised, which consequences are moral, and what is ethic, and which... Should we construct a socially based ethic that will be opposite to personally based ethic or something else? I don't know exactly, because I'm not specialist in science and technology studies, and this is a new field of investigation for me, and I think that it's very interesting, and there is an opportunity for interdisciplinary investigations, and it's evident. It is evident, I think I say okay. And so I would like to address to the article of Britt Holbrook and Adam Briegel, with title Knowing and Acting, the Precautionary and Proactionary Principles in Relation to Policy Making. And in this article they cite Nietzsche and his words, and following words. Knowledge, Nietzsche said, knowledge kills action. Knowledge kills action, and so if we think about principle, if we think about precautionary principle as opposite to proactionary principle, so they posed, I think, a proper question. We have started. We start from the question how much knowledge we should have before acting, and they propose to shift to to move to the another question, more fundamental question. They formulate this question in following way. Conceptually more fundamental question, how are knowledge and action related? And of course, this is a philosophical question, but I don't think that we should discuss it, that this is philosophical. Okay. And they wrote at the end of the article interesting thing. They wrote following: acting on the basis of predetermined principles is not really acting. That is, acting on the basis of predetermined principles rules out the possibility of giving ourselves. And I think that, of course, this is a crucial point that say about ourselves, not yourself, of course, and rules out the possibility of giving ourselves the principles according to which we act, since they are already given to us. Right. Say, if we know in advance of acting what we ought to do, we are determined by that knowledge. And I think that this is an interesting point for discussing concerning about question of relation between knowledge and action. But what about ethic, about role of ethic in science and technology governance? What governance should be with ethic? What ethic? And so ethic says us about how should we act, how should we do, and so you've seen that so I think that maybe discuss it. What do you think? Action, knowledge, how they related to each other? Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so the next is a joint presentation by Elena and Evgenia, and the questionnaire for that the research is based on I will be passing around now to you.
Okay, well, I'm happy to start this presentation. It's not going to be too long because we've got about 4 slides to start with, and the idea, it's part of our projects with the Soros Foundation, but also with the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. And we kind of developed a sense of curiosity about the issue, and it's driven by observation, because we're going to all sorts of different places and conferences where you can hear governance talk. You just realize not so much of talk is happening in Russian. And we also struggled a bit with translation, what governance means, how we translate it properly, sorts of synonyms that also kind of raise further questions about what we're talking about when we're talking about governance. And we realized that a number of networks, informal networks, organizations, talk about global governance of science and technology. And we ventured out with a survey that was online for, I think it's still online actually, so that you have, and we asked mostly colleagues in STS, but also in international relations and policy making, to actually have a go and give us answers to these questions. To what extent we were successful, we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's been an introduction to the kind of background of this project. So just also give you an idea that this survey was accomplished from Tomsk, and because that's a past center that is just designed and implemented the projects, the pilot projects. So I think we have an interesting combination of backgrounds here, because I know something about science and technology studies. Evgenia has background in international relations with a PhD from MIMO, Moscow Institute of International Relations. And we got interested in how these global agendas and the governance of science and technology are being put together. So Jenny may say a little bit more about the setup, about this more systemic approach to governance.
I will try to speak English, but if it will be difficult for me, I will say English, sorry, because I have no time to think more deep about it. So it was it's some complicated situation because we have two different languages. Because we have the language of international relations experts and experts from STS. So we have absolutely, not absolutely, but controversy between the ideas about the global governance of science and technology development. Because our colleagues from international research sphere, they say in terms of the international system, not global system. They think about the unit, in terms of different elements and connections between them, and they use the term of policy, economics, market, developing country, undeveloped country, and so on. So we have a few different points about the global system, governance system in science and technology. First of all is the idea that economic power is defend what kind of opportunity has a country to participators from the country in the global forums, global discussion forums. And they said that only United States and Western Europe say the rule of game. They push on the person from undeveloped country, and even, for example, China, they try to make some kind of other standards and make it more widespread, but it was unsuccessful attempt. And they said that it's because China has political frame and democratic country, and now it is not world leader. And it was idea that it was more useful for a developed country to make some kind of coalition to make the idea about the science and technology development, but they now see only strategy to join to United States each other, and they play against each other in this sphere. It's the first point. The second point was that because in innovation system now is defined by economic demand. That's why a developed country, a lot of them has a big potential market of consumption. consumption. So now they may define and push develop country, Western countries, and they have big opportunity to influence in this forum. The other idea was that because this country, for example, India and China, they can't influence on the road system, they have a strategy of exit strategy by Tom and Hirschman, and they make their own fora where they invite the person from Western countries and from United States, but they try to have their own agenda, and it's not close country, it's not close agenda, but they try to make their own, which there is no in Russian policy now, deciding policy now, this third position. So.
One of the examples of how the international relations and scientific technology can be spoken about, but we observe some kind of very tendency in this kind of discourses when we're asking questions about what's the object of governance, what kind of language can be used to discuss science and technology governance, and whether that kind of more systemic tool trying to categorize, classify participants or actors in this kind of governance processes, whether that can resist the challenge that science and technology studies can pose to that kind of discourses of governance of science and technology. So instead of sort of buying into that kind of questions about international relations involved, we decided to say we know with STS that there might be alternative kinds of ways of talking about science and technology that adopt some kind of constitutive approach, which is kind of a classic in STS. So you're saying technology to some extent involved in co-constructing, co-producing identities, practices, agency, and so on. So in many ways, it follows kind of an approach developed by Foucault. So what kind of subject positions for an individual are available in the governance discourses in relation to science and technology? So that's the kind of the starting premise that we decided that we would like to pursue in the further analysis. Right?
And the next language which using our experts from STS, it was, they said about the global governance in science and technology, they using only idea of funding and educational program for young. I don't know. I think,
Елена, может быть, следующий слайд? Okay, so basically the idea was also that the survey can help us to revisit some approaches in science and technology studies in the context of global governance of science and technology. We kind of turned to an earlier debate in STS about interests and explanations in science. And the question for us was what happens when we put this question in the context of governance or global governance. Whether that might help us to renew the debate about the interests and explanations in science and technology, because that immediately leads us on to questions about whose interests in science and technology, whose explanations, who's setting the agenda in the governance dialogues. So in some senses it joins the existing debate in the science and technology studies. What or where should we look for if we look for the processes involved in production of scientific facts and technologies? So whether we should move beyond the laboratory studies and beyond the laboratory in order to understand the construction of facts. We also have to take out the increasing public access to scientific data, or at least demands for public access to scientific data. And also the recent interest in the political accountability of scientists, and opens up much wider space for deliberation about the involved agency and capacity to produce scientific knowledge, its utility, its consequences, and as Nikolai said, eventually ethical issues involved. So, and similarly, putting questions from that kind of perspective also helps us to set up a broader context for international relations as objects of inquiry in a very similar way, in the language of co-construction of science and technology and international relations involved in setting agendas and governance processes for science and technology. And from that kind of point of view, I think the questions about values will also come to the fore in public deliberations, and particularly if you look at how values are constructed in the example that Jenny gave about sort of partitioning the world into parts that are becoming subject to governance and agenda setting by those kind of more powerful institutions, if you like. But again, from the STS perspective, it's time to question how these power relations are constructed, what kind of material practices are involved, and kind of referring to that early debates about the sociology of monsters, eventually, if you like, about what's involved in constituting the agendas and governance processes. So another question I wanted to put for discussion here is about what's the place for value-neutral science in the globalizing world? Well, we have to think about the third world countries, or the kind of the bottom of the pyramid, and all the questions that it will involve the interests of underprivileged countries as well. So. Oh yes, okay. Yeah, well, we mentioned briefly that's also about the subject positions and role in governance processes. So it's a kind of a bit from the interviews that we came across talking to the experts, if you like, because we consider the language of expertise kind of the lingua franca in the discourses about governance, because when we ask questions about what does governance involve, immediately all these narratives about expertise and politics of expertise become very central to the responses that we were getting. Similarly, the kind of the expression, the rules of the game as well, quite important. So kind of understanding the governance process is a kind of a game when one needs to find its own kind of mode of acting or its own identity. So we kind of started asking questions about how well these international or global platforms work, which is the distinction itself between global and international is quite problematic in a sense, but in a good old methodological sense, if you like, because we want to understand when it's useful for participants to understand this kind of activities as global or international, what that would entail in terms of formation of identities and power relations and so on. They kind of also ask questions about degrees of informality in these procedures, what kind of bureaucracies are involved or are not involved. There was an interesting issue about passive participation in science and technology governance, when there is this kind of realization that someone else is doing global governance, but I'm not doing the global governance, and yet someone, the respondent, would feel that they are involved passively. As an example, we spoke to an economist who felt that she was governed somehow by an algorithm which the World Bank possesses, and she has to devise her own calculation and decision making based on given data, given analysis that the World Bank had already accomplished. But these are kind of details, just to give you an idea what kind of details we wanted to kind of get to grips with when we were talking to our respondents. And we had a few issues for discussion, just to maybe have some input from you, if you like to join this kind of conversation, because, well, it's first of all the issue of labeling. How does the distinction between global and international achieved? As I mentioned, whether it might be useful to sit down and look at all those mission statements that are being available on the internet about the global governance of science and technology. Again, kind of turn to expertise as the lingua franca, but look at it not to take it for granted, but question it from science and technology studies perspective, because expertise has been extensively researched and theorized in STS, if you like. We also wanted to understand what kind of role the STS speak about governance place when it turns out to be strongly focused on mechanisms rather than substance of science and technology. We had very few responses that actually characterize a particular field of science and technology, but being really kind of filled with a description of what kind of funds, organizations supporting mobility and international network projects are involved, existing forums, educational projects for new generation of researchers. So what kind of what that kind of rhetoric, what it's actually doing. The language of governance itself is very interesting. The kind of metaphors and umbrella terms involved. But interestingly enough, the questionnaire that was put online, we actually had to some extent abandon the idea because we had a few kind of interesting responses, a few very short responses, but some of our participants said, well, actually I went for question 1, question 2, question 3, just I have to think about it, and just didn't get many responses on this for this online survey. And and another issue that came out from the interviews quite strongly is to what extent we actually need to add another angle onto the discourses of governance and actually look at how problems are constituted and whether we can find something that might help us to research a little bit more the potential for problem-oriented approach for science and technology, as well as technology assessment, and in many cases driven by underdeveloped countries. These are the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to open the floor now for questions. We've already had some issues laid on the table. Does anyone want to begin? Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let me address my question and a comment to the last presentation. To both speakers maybe. So it is very interesting. Thank you. And I'm very interested in how your project develops. And one comment I have is you study the institutional. You study the problems that are located in the institutions themselves, governance, then some academical institutions, and so on. But there is something that is between different ones, different types of media. I mean, even traditional media that is in public space, or some communication that is beyond grants and something that is connected with it. So that is my comment. I think that maybe taking into consideration these projects, processes of transformation is important because these different terms may be different throughout. Some initiatives come from governments to scientists and then back. So that is a comment and that is a question. If you are interested in this transformation, and do you think that something transforms with the terms when this communication is processed?
Well, I think we had kind of a telling example about this kind of issues based on China. When Rachel was sitting there, she was helping us with an interview with some Chinese officials, and the question that we were trying to understand was about what it means for them to be involved in governance initiatives as an individual or representative or an institution or even a nation. And then actually we've got some fragments in the interview that actually you still have to analyze about how these several distinctions are made, in the sense that you want to, that kind of subject position thing, when you want to make sense of the presence of individuals in the governance context, what kind of discourse is happening.
Well, can I ask Dmitry a question?
Oh, of course. We agree to improvise.
Yes. And this has to do with the general point about how, in terms of the relative ranking and status of research in Russia, that international level is the only thing that counts, not local research. And I was wondering to what extent that also applies to business schools. Because in the UK, I'll give you a contrasting situation. In the UK, the Minister for Universities gave a keynote lecture to the annual meeting of the Business Studies Scholars Group in Britain. And basically was saying that business studies in Britain was too oriented toward the academic international sphere and wasn't doing enough to actually improve the economy of Britain. And that what, in terms of what was improving the economy of Britain seemed to be happening entirely outside of business schools. And this is a disgrace to business schools. And so, in fact, he explicitly said that this business of chasing academic rankings internationally is completely useless for a business school. Insofar as there's going to be any kind of government provision for it or anything of that kind. And I'm just wondering, does any of that enter into the thinking as a kind of counterbalance to what you've been talking about?
Oh, well, interesting question, and obviously our data is not that much about business schools, but what we have very interesting material on resource allocation through venture funds and the cooperation between universities, companies, and startups. And in this context, it is interesting that criteria for giving money to a startup project, to a startup company, is also really close to international, potential international market value. So basically, if your business idea and your experience is potentially valuable to make a bigger international business, it's much better than some local enterprise that will be pretty cool for, say, Tomsk region, but still not good comparing to potential competition on the global market. So in this context, it's the same. So Jenny wants to say something. So.
Yeah, do you want to come in on this? Yes.
I think that it's some different level of international object, because when Dima told and when experts told in our interviews about the international assessment from point of international ideas, it's almost all of experts told not about the subject of research, because subject is about Russia, but all of them should be, all of applicants should say a few words about it. In international literature we have, but in Russia, for Russia, so it's, I think, because we don't have a situation like in Britain when they wrote about outside subject. We don't have such a high
Я вопрос просто хотела сказать. Вы говорите, что когда предметом исследования являются российские регионы или какая-то российская проблематика, это не котируется при получении грантов, да? Не это? Не это, например.
Я сказала, что у нас не стоит вопрос о том, что объектом исследования становится нероссийским. Случаи, что-то нероссийское.
Да, но речь не об исследованиях, а об школах и включенности в рыночные дела.
Да, вот это что. Иногда просто для зарубежных грантов, наоборот, интересна российская тематика, для того, чтобы более исследовать вот эту вот сферу, чтобы как-то ее понять и каким-то образом действовать на этом рынке. То есть она более, так сказать, интересна.
Потому что кроме одного человека из всех аппликантов, которых мы опрашивали во всех вузах и даже в Академии наук, кроме одного человека ни один из них не носит получении международных денег?
На российскую.
Только на российские фонды, российские эксперты.
Значит, я как-то...
Сколько человек было сегодня?
So, continuing the discussion that Steve started with his anecdote about the UK minister criticizing this focus on excellence and calling for more, say, local relevance, I think there is a general movement, and the situation, let me say first, the situation in the UK is actually exasperated by the research assessment exercise and reference to international ratings and so on. Well, in general, what I think is happening is a often interesting combination of global excellence and local relevance. And we've been studying centers with both excellence and relevance, research centers, and we've been looking at clusters, regional clusters in nanotechnology in particular, because that's the area that I've been looking at a lot. And I think you see that combination, and so you see interesting links between the global and the national, which can be phrased in terms of excellence and relevance, but it's not just that, because also the relevance can be global, as when you think of global markets, but also in terms of the more ethical issues, you could say. I've been involved a little bit in an initiative of two nanotechnology policymakers, let's call it, or administrators, for a global or an international dialogue on responsible development of nanotechnology. So clearly, it's not just about governance, it's actually about good governance. But it's also fraught with difficulties to get various nations together and so on. I mean, Xenia knows all about international relations, and this is a good example. At the same time, they were able to get a number of people, including people from nanotechnology centers, involved in discussions. And now the whole thing has fizzled out, but for about 10 years, it was an interesting venture. So that is an immediate response to what you were saying, that there maybe you have to shift the focus a little bit and look at interesting new ventures. It does imply, my few examples now, that I think whatever there is in terms of global governance, it will be a patchwork of very different things. And so that implies that it's difficult to actually respond to your questionnaire. And I'm saying that also as a sort of profession, because I got the questionnaire, I got a reminder, and I didn't answer, because after the first few questions, I just got confused.
So this is who you're referring to.
and so I thought, and also the terminology, so I thought, okay, I give up. But the giving up is perhaps another data for your whole project, that you can't really say very much systematically about global governance. I could continue with my overall improvised thoughts, but this is what I wanted to say now.
Do you want to answer? I want to respond a little bit, maybe bring in Nikolai into the discussion. When people responded to the questionnaire, which is all about governance, did anyone spontaneously bring up ethics as part of what governance might be in terms of these questions?
I don't think so. I think the issue close to that was, I mean, the responses were, I'd say, they tried to sociologize governance in a sense, not begin with kind of ethical categories. There was more discussion about how do you educate the new generation of policymakers, for instance. What would they have to have as their training? What kind of organizations might help? What kind of programs can be useful here as well? So I don't think that these issues were framed in terms of ethics initially, although we had some practical suggestions in terms of where this kind of new generation of policymakers might be interested to go, what kind of networks to join, what kind of issues might be considered. I think we got this kind of response from about ethics of ICT in Africa, I think, but that was the only one.
I mean, one other follow-up, and again, going back to Nikolai's talk. Did you detect, when people spoke about governance, that they had in mind, in some way, the precautionary principle as being operative in governance? No, this is to you. Yes, it's about his question, but it's directed to you.
No, we didn't have responses that address the principles of governance. And that's an interesting finding, I think. But again, as I agree with Ari, we need to take all these things ethnographically in a sense, not be disappointed or kind of maintain the sense of surprise what's happening when we talk about governance. So I don't think the premise of the responses was to we have to rely on the existing categories. And ethics is an established category when we talk about science and technology in some circles and all sorts of ethics journals and things like that. So, but we didn't get that from the responses.
Just before, do you want to add something to this, Nikolai?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, in order to answer something, I should be sure that I understood you correctly. Yes? Okay. And so, if am I right? You said that we are not responsible for the principal governance. The principal governance. Please, what the conclusion that you made in one or two sentences? I'm sorry because English is not native for me, and I not learned wrote, okay, and so on. Sorry. Please repeat last two sentences. Sorry. In order I understood.
Who are you? Is this just to you?
Yes, Elena. Yes.
Okay. Responsibility for what exactly?
For all the governance of technology.
I guess.
Okay. Yes. This is fun. Yes.
Maybe if I can. I guess part of the issue is, are you presupposing anything about the nature of governance in terms of how it happens in the way you're designing the questionnaire already? You know, so you see, in other words, there might be some. You might say some principles of, and maybe this kind of speaks to the fact that Ari couldn't relate to your questionnaire, that there may be some background assumptions in a sense, perhaps guiding the thing, right, that need to be made more explicit.
Well, thanks for that, because that's precisely what I think we were trying to achieve, to get some view about what kind of assumptions we might have about governance. Well, I think we did have some assumptions because, for instance, about responsibility and governance as well, because I've been involved in responsible research and innovation sort of activities and publications as well. Well, I guess questions about metaphors, classifications, and umbrella terms were quite close to at least what I was doing, but actually that was one of the hopes that people will jump on this question and say, yes, we know everything about umbrella terms and metaphors because we're involved in that kind of thing. But that was one of the interesting moments here, that we didn't get much of the kind of data about that. And I think the question about democratic and non-democratic participation carries some kind of assumption, because I think we all, well, particularly if you would be going to kind of SES conferences, and more international conferences, the participatory discourses are very kind of strong on the agenda, and so we just started pondering about whether participation, deliberation, and democracy, anything related, that might be not a very successful framing eventually. Who knows? So, and assumptions about we assume there might be some practical mechanisms, but I think we trapped ourselves with this question, particularly in interviews, because we got quite lengthy responses from those managing those international grant schemes and exchange programs. Yes, and then I think we might reframe that a little bit too.
Actually, most of us worked on this guide, and Dima, Nikolai, Елена, and me. And before the work of this questionnaire, we share a few papers, and read it and think about it was papers about and metaphors and about the international relations and about NGO, international relations and essays. So we share some kind of literature, and after we worked on this questionnaire, I think during a couple months, and redefined and tried to ask young people, are they understand what we need? And of course we have some kind of pre-knowledge.
It wasn't some kind of literature, it was like cream, proper.
Yes. Speak to the microphone. Speak to everyone.
No, just comment to what Jenny said. It wasn't some kind of literature. It was like
really relevant to the topic, international journals, and proper stuff to formulate at least background something. To start with something.
Might be because all of us has absolutely different background and have such kind of questionnaire difficult for any researchers.
Yeah, I think, and then we'll go back to you.
I don't know how much, 25 minutes for intervention is okay. First, I filled in the questionnaire based on what I understand from the question, and I think it was, I found some sense in it, but when I'm confronted with a topic like this, which is not in my field, actually. I started with the classical method in sociology and sociology, and I went to laboratory study for 15 years, and then to some entrepreneurship, innovation. When I say governance, for me, it's in the political field, which always presupposes, let's call this subject, some agent who is in a way, they know I can't think of governance without someone taking responsibilities, projecting something. And in this sense, it's also related with power in very general sense. So I'll give an example of a country because I'm in Bulgarian science for almost 30 years. And I started my PhD in the Department of Social Science and Technical Progress in mid-80s when Bulgaria was the fourth country, although a small Asian country, according to the number of scientists per capita. After Japan, Russia, and the United States, it was Bulgaria, or GDP about. So more than 4,000 per million population. And also we have some field of industry which are, according to our studies, very well developed, like computer industry. In military industry was 12 countries in the world for export of military equipment in mid-80s. Also some other sectors. And I know from my coming in this field that in State Committee for Science and Technical Progress, which was the name of that time, there was really body who was somehow collecting information and managing what we call government in very different levels. First, there was a special institute called Institute of Science and Technical Information, which was huge access to all literature in the field, in electronic industry, in military industry, in some related fields. And also, for example, when they started developing electronic industry in late 60s, they said top 30 students in technical school go directly to the Institute of Electronics without going to the army, which was a huge incentive. And this provision lasted for 30 years. So after this few decades of 10-15 years, we have already highly competitive environment with the top 30 engineers in the country, which will set up specialization abroad. And what was surprised to learn in my study in the late 80s and 90s that actually there's no iron curtain at all. Bulgaria as a state possessed companies in Silicon Valley, in England, in fact in West Germany, which were a mechanism for transferring technology and know-how from the West to the country and somehow maintaining. And all this is managed, and also at the Central Committee there's a special department for science and technical espionage, which was government policy. And one of our top spy interview told me, well, until Reagan, Western legislation in industrial espionage is very weak because they treat it as an inter-company espionage, not as an inter-country. So we are stealing a lot of amount of technology from the West just for nothing. And Italians are very easy to buy all over the world, and they are bringing us information. So it was only after Reagan they tightened relationships, so they managed to put some of our top. So they still, for example, they still the technology from wax computers, which is able to, in the early 80s to manage ballistic missiles. And they steal it to Singapore, to Brazil, as Reagan equipment with aluminium foil inside. But they smuggled a lot of other pieces of equipment there, and then they do reverse engineering in Bulgaria, started producing just 2 years later after they discovered this computer. When the Russians saw it, they said, we need this power military, and they started pushing this. So we have a country which the government and also the Zhivkov himself, who is got this hierarchical pyramid, he said he invented the slogan, Bulgaria, technical nation, communist nation. So he already close to directly technical progress with communist ideal, and whole the state machine was somehow mobilized to do this. And then I can see the government and the governance, and also this kind of how to say in scientific communication, in traveling abroad, grants, etc. Then it came what Russian colleague knows stole democratic as well. When all this disappeared for a couple of years, and I have a friend of mine in the United States who published this marvelous book. It is his PhD dissertation for the university, I know some of the Wisconsin. It's called, I'll state the title in English because it is first translated in Bulgaria, the Praying of the State. And he said actually that we, the communist country, bring some completely new phenomenon in the world history, because modern history from the 17th century almost related that somehow you mobilize resources and you are suppressing local agent, every modern country, Britain, in order to achieve some collective goals which are beneficial for all. So in a way, modern state developed as a modern state with resources, mobilizing. It was different on scheme, Anglo-Saxon, continental, Prussian model, French model, Russian model, but all modern states somehow constituted, centralized some kind of resource, invent some policy, and the communism was on the fire when the country mobilized total resources and dispossessed it. But just after the fall of communism, it was this huge concentration of power and assets was, in order to privatize this and to take it, we have to dismantle this enormous mechanism of governance and steering. And actually what happened in the 90s, that in order this, I call this party nomenclature, try to become the new economic master, they dismantled constantly all these institutional governments. And this book described how all database, scientific database, economic database, a system of collecting this data will privatize, dismantled in order not to be accountable of all this possible privatization, etc. So in a way, your question is, it came after the big forest fire. It is nothing remained in these countries. And eventually, after 15 years, we were attached to the European Union, but this is completely strange, like as a kind of tribes coming to the civilized nation. So some people are looking what the European Union is doing, and some try to mimic, but it is just re-emerging slowly. Plus the fact that in countries like Bulgaria, there's no local businesses, because actually the big business of this, our economic master, is just to take the assets and to sell them, especially the whole electronic industry was just a nice example. Bulgaria was the third country in the world which managed in '88 to create city technology of its own. Philips made it in 84, then Japanese companies in 87, and then 88 our digital system in South America. So it's a huge market for CD late 80s. So in 89, what they did, they just sold two plants which are able to produce about 100 million per year production for 7 million, just the equipment sold to a German company, West German company, which resold the whole equipment to IBM for 25 million. And this is, they just ruined the whole business, but they took this money because they are not able to control what happens next 10 years. So it is kind of just pirating of your own economy, your own industry. And then after that they went with this money to a nice estate, big nice houses, etc. So what I'm saying is that in order to have this question of governments, you somehow tacitly assumes that there is subject behind. More, maybe in Russia we have such, maybe the last 10 years. But this is absolutely irrelevant, and so instead of the governments, we have a kind of survival strategy, because I said that we're not a big scientific community for the size of the country. So actually we have these institutes, university, who for the last 15 years, I would say, designed by local survival strategy to integrate themselves to the global scientific community, to sell themselves or to be subcontractor of the foreign company or foreign research institute, etc. And you may call this government, but this is quite a different level of government. Yeah, maybe I was too long, but it's just to give you kind of.
She's ready to respond.
So are you implying we were asking silly dated questions?
Pardon?
Did we ask silly dated questions about governance?
Silly dated questions.
What I'm saying that maybe they are relevant for you, and I now realize why you read, because I read here the Federal Target Program cadre of the Ministry of Science and Education, which means that you still have a subject agent who is interested in some kind of data, who is already very interesting, even shining from
interesting. Yeah, that's because I think, well, if we put some kind of framings on the question of governance, but the most interesting answers we had were from individuals who said, I just came from there, I just did that, I just published here, I just said that, and so on. It's just very much of that kind of individual input that we had, that we thought was very interesting, or as kind of more suggestions how to actually stimulate this kind of activities, in a sense that just to increase kind of engagement with the current process that you might be describing eventually. So not just kind of sticking to our framework for governance. And
if I may, I think there is, the people who like to talk about governance generally make a very strong distinction between governance and government. Okay? And so in a sense, the term governance is kind of trying to capture what you're talking about, a kind of post-state world, where there are multiple different levels of control happening simultaneously, right? And where the state at most is just one player and maybe a fairly diminished player. So in a sense, I think the word governance actually is intended to capture kind of the phenomena you're talking about, and it shouldn't be seen as referring to government necessarily. Yeah.
Okay, we're getting close to 7:30. Ari, I know, has a question. Should we take that? Yes.
Well, I'll check with you because I looked at my watch as well. When you asked whether there was any reference to precautionary principle, I thought that this international dialogue that I mentioned already is a very interesting example of how that plays a role. But I'll leave it with you whether you want to hear about it.
Well, I know. The point is that is kind of what I had in the back of my mind that may have come up actually in the, because that may have been like a very natural thing to talk about in the context of governance from the standpoint of the respondents. They may have brought up the precautionary principle as a kind of governance principle in general. That was kind of what I was asking about, but I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I know about that.
So, shall I...
yeah, in case people aren't familiar with it, yeah.
Okay. The international dialogue for responsible development of nanotechnology, nanosciences was actually not, well, it mentioned precautionary principle, but was more general prudence about possible side effects. And it was an initiative of Mike Rocco, the leader of the North American National Nanotechnology Initiative and the director of the EU program on nanotechnology, and they have been getting together early 2000s, and they were very concerned that their joint interest in getting nanotechnology on the map and working would be problematic because of this discussion about side effects, particularly nanoparticles that would be running loose and having all sorts of bad effects, both toxic and in terms of reproducing nanorobots. And so they got these people, lots of people together from various nation states, but always informally. There should not be formal representation, because then you get in all these problems of who can say what and who a nation state doesn't want to commit itself. So the first one was already reasonably successful. Actually, historically speaking, the EU Code of Conduct for nanosciences and nanotechnologies is one of the outcomes, but indirectly, of this. But the key thing which was discussed there, and then also in the next meetings, was that they were afraid of there being rogue countries, as they called it. That's rogue. So you would have the US, you would have Europe having codes of conduct, be very careful, be precautionary, prudent, and so on. And then there would be, and they didn't always name countries, but they had some in mind, and they were very concerned that that shouldn't happen. It's not because they didn't want another side effect, they didn't want to have the promotion of nanotechnology compromised. So they were prudent, but in their particular way. And then the whole thing ran aground in two steps. One was that in the second meeting in Brussels, the first one was the United States, the second meeting in Brussels was cancelled, had to be cancelled because the American State Department came in and said, this is security stuff, you know, this is diplomacy, and you're not going to do what you want to do informally, we will say what you can do, what you cannot do. So Brussels cancelled that meeting. And then finally, after a number of negotiations, Japan did the meeting, and that was sort of allowed as a third party. Then Brussels did it, and then Russian Federation said, we will do the next meeting, because they were building up their nanotechnology profile, but they never got around to it. The best they did was have a small session in their national nanotechnology conferences, and so now the whole thing has run to halt. And still you see bits and pieces there. I mean, in East Asia I see some remnants. South Africa is trying to do something, but not very much. So it's a little bit of history where you see a number of different things getting together, including individual statement initiatives. So I think it's a very interesting story for the overall notion of governance, and particularly good governance.
Do you want to say something, please?
Well, yes, I think it's interesting to look at the governance from the perspective of people who are under the governance, right? And I have this data-driven inspiration from the interviews. Again, people who apply for grants, make their decisions about their research projects, and they're trying to understand how to apply, what is the orientation for application and for research work. And my perception and sort of, again, inspiration is that they perceive this international pressure, this international governance as a sort of flowing something, as flows of ideas in magazines and journals, flows of conference people and leading presentations and discussions, flows of equipment and old stuff, new stuff, and then flows sort of, how to say, expectations. So there is no exact result, there is a lot of gossip about it. Then, of course, flows of money, because all different agencies in the world redistribute money and change priorities if you have the picture, or at least try to get this picture of these flows, and if you are able to jump into this flow, this what means to play with this government from the inside, because there is no perception that somebody in the scientific world there is a government. There is no government. There is this kind of strange, self-organized pressure of the scientific flows instead of the institutional sort of framework. This is what I got from the interviews engaged.
Is that right? Okay. With the interest of dinner in mind here, I think we'll put this to close now, and there'll be opportunities to pick up some of this perhaps tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. Yes.